John Williard, who is now our chairman of the Historical Commission, and he has written a book about the Wixom Inn that doesn't exist anymore. And it's fascinating. John, how did you become interested in the Wixom Inn?
Well, as you're probably aware, I've been a member of the Farmington Historical Society since moving here in early '81. And going to a lot of the wonderful meetings over the years. At one of the meetings, why a show and tell session, there were Wixom brother and sister, and I don't know if you remember their names, but
Ralph and Adelaide and Dorothy.
Yeah, oh, three, okay.
Yeah.
And for their show and tell, they had this old newspaper article about the Wixom Inn, and their last name was Wixom, so of course it was from their family. And they read it, and everybody was getting a big kick out of it, but I couldn't hear most of what they were reading, but it just was something that was always fascinating to me. And especially the fact that it was a place that didn't exist anymore, and in fact, a lot of people really didn't even know where it was, where it had been. Mm-hmm. And I couldn't find anybody that had ever seen it with their own eyes. So it just was something that seemed like it was sort of a mystery, and I was interested in knowing more about it. And so as a result, started to do some investigation. And on our historical commission for the Farmington Hills, we were looking for a place to set up another historical marker, and I said, well, why don't we do one on the Wixom Inn? And everybody agreed, and so that we got launched into this whole topic.
And you found a lot of information that nobody thought existed, that awful picture and the awful feeling about the inn, the way it's called benign neglect. They just let it fall down, which was so sad.
Well, it's a very interesting story. I can't take credit for finding all of the information. Yes, I found some of it, but Brian Golden, who we both know well, was instrumental through the Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society in finding some scrapbook materials, and that led to going to up to Lansing and doing some research there, looking through old newspaper files, and there I found even more. So it's a very interesting trail, and it's amazing what you can find out with a little bit of luck and things falling in place at the right time.
Well, when you were doing the book, I was disturbed that you were just going to use that old picture, but you were able to figure out the dimensions and do a drawing for Brian.
Yeah.
And then Brian went and made this adorable model of how it looked when it was in good shape.
Right. This would have been the last version of the inn as it looked in the 1850s. But maybe we can talk about the history of the place and how it got started and why it's called the Wixom Inn, the Walker Inn, and it has several different names, and I think it's kind of interesting. Anyway, I have prepared some maps and so on, which we'll take a closer look at as we go through. The first one just shows the overall Farmington Township area. For those of you who aren't familiar with township layout, townships are made of 36 sections, numbered 1 through 36, and each one of them is 1 mile on a side. Mm-hmm. And typically people bought quarter sections back in the old days, which would have been 160 acres. It would have been measured a half a mile by half a mile. Wealthy people bought more, and rarely did you buy less than that. Anyway, the old maps show all of the little sections, and usually they put people's names down there so you can see who owned what and so on. And it's kind of interesting to see where the different families settled and how they moved over time. On this first map here, I've kind of laid out the people that are involved in the inn property here. And that would be 3 different families. That would be the Walkers, and then it would be the Philbricks, and then lastly, the Wixoms. And the Walker, which is laid out here in blue, shows the land that they bought originally in June of 1824. And there's a lighter blue section here that they bought a little bit later in August of the same year, but was sold not long after that. So I don't know if it was a speculation deal or they were going to move and decided not to or what. So they were down here, which is the area where the inn was located. So that they bought there and stayed in that area. Now, the second family that was involved in that was the Philbricks. Now, the Philbricks bought this land here, which is in Brown, and it's interesting, they bought a quarter section, but they bought it on each side of a major section line road, which is unusual in the time period. So this is right at the intersection, essentially, of Power Road and 11 Mile, as we call them today, as you well know. And then surrounding that area were lands that were bought by the Wixoms originally, so there had to be a very close association between the Wixoms and the Walkers, because the two families essentially settled next door to one another. And then a little bit later on, in 1830, there was a movement from this purple area on the map where the Wixoms originally settled to land a little bit further north and west, which is, it just shows that they did buy and sell land and move around from time to time, and that's kind of a key point in the development of the inn. So with that as a sort of an overview, there's another map that I think is kind of interesting, and it shows the Walker land as it was in June of 1824. Now, one of the things I think that's really interesting and I think important for people to know is that when the land was originally surveyed, starting in 1817, down in Wayne County and then branching out west and north from there, they didn't build roads. They traveled by streams and rivers, and they traveled by Indian paths, and they marked what were known as the section lines down. This was so that if you wanted to buy a piece of land, of course, you would know where its boundaries were, which is key. You can't buy something when you can't define it. And I happen to have an extremely rare item with me today that we'll take a closer look at. This is a farmer's map of Michigan from 1835. And very rarely do these survive in this good a condition, complete with the original leather cover. The map is what I call the original gas station maps. Of course, they didn't have gas stations back then. And why I say that, it looks like a book. It's nice and leather bound. It says Farmer's Map of Michigan, exhibiting the sections. And as you open it up, there's some reading here, which we will get to in a minute. And then the map itself unfolds like you would think of in a gas station map. As I said, we'll take a look at this more closely later on. And it unfolds several times to reveal the parts of Michigan that were actually surveyed at the time the map was printed in 1835. If it wasn't surveyed, you couldn't buy it. So these maps came out every year, and every year there was more and more land surveyed. And in fact, the true shape of Michigan was only discovered after they did the survey of all of the parts of Michigan and could put it together like a giant puzzle.
It was part of the Northwest Ordinance that was
Yes.
written by Thomas Jefferson, our third president, I believe he was third, wasn't he? And he was a surveyor as a young man.
Yes.
And then he understood how to do this, and that's why our Northwest Ordinance has such nice, neat little squares.
Well, the whole story about the shape of Michigan is a whole other topic, which I'm kind of working on in the background, but I haven't really gotten serious about it yet, but I will. Anyway, one of the things that I wanted to kind of point out was in the front of this map little booklet here, there's a page which starts off with a declaration, and it says, I should point out, this map cost $2 in 1835. And $2 was a huge sum of money in 1835.
You worked for $1 a day.
Yeah, if you were good. And while in the 1830s, for instance, if you had a 160-acre working farm, that was your business, that was your livelihood, your taxes for the year would be less than $10. $6, $7 a year was typical. So $2 for a map was huge money in that time period, especially to people who'd had very little money. They mostly bartered and traded, but you couldn't trade a chicken for this because they wanted the money. Anyway, I don't want to digress too much, but there's a declaration here at the top, and it says, and this is a sales pitch for why you should spend $2 to buy this map, and it says if anybody who has this map cannot get lost in the state of Michigan, or Michigan territory at that point. And then it has a little section here of explanation, and it tells you about how the sections are laid out and how they're numbered. And then it has a section down here which is called proof. This is like a mathematical proof as to why they can make that statement that you can't get lost. And basically what it says is if you find yourself anywhere in the middle of the vast wilderness of Farmington Township, for instance, in that time period, that you would just walk in any direction until you came to a line of blazed trees. Now, a blazed tree is a tree that has a hatchet mark in it, usually done in two directions to take out a V-shaped chunk of wood, and it permanently marks the tree. When the surveyors surveyed the area, as I said before, they didn't make any roads. They just laid their instruments out. When they found the line that marked the section line, all the trees that fell on that line as they looked through their instrument were marked with these blazing marks. So what this says is that you walk in any direction till you come across a line of blazed trees. You see all those little hatchet marks going down the trees. You know you're on a section line. You can turn left or right, it doesn't matter. And you continue until you come to an intersection, a 90-degree intersection of another line of blazed trees going in the other direction. At that intersection, there's a little post, and hatcheted out on that post is Roman numerals that will be the township, the section, and so on number that where you're located. You can look that up on the map, then you know exactly where you are.
Were those made of wood or were they?
They were typically stumps of trees, so it would be wonderful to have one of those today. I don't know of any that exist, but that's how they navigated back then. The point being, they didn't have roads, so they traveled by streams, as we said before, and they also traveled by Indian trails. That leads us to this map that the first map that I wanted to talk about, which showed you what the Walker land looked like in 1824 in June when he purchased the land. Now on here I've pointed out where today's 10 Mile Road is and where today's Halstead Road is, because those are the major mile roads that are nearby where this inn was eventually built. Understanding that those were not roads in those days and didn't exist. They were just a line of blazed trees. But also put on here is the old Grand River Indian Path, which shows you as closely as I can determine how it went through this area.
Those were bent trees.
They had, the Indians would take a branch and they would bend it when the tree was young, and then it would grow up and it would have a 90-degree bend on it. And there's still a few of those trees around.
There's one in Heritage Park, but they don't tell you where it is because they don't want anybody near it.
There's a couple of them near the Simmons house too, which is not directly on an Indian trail, but they look like marker trees and have been.
They were on. That was an Indian trail. The trails didn't go straight.
Well, I'm not perfectly familiar with where the trails went, but yeah, there are marker trees there. They're very interesting, and as I said, there's just a handful of them left. Anyway, this Indian path then would have been very heavily traveled. Settlers moving out into the wilderness would be going through there, would need a place to stay for the night. And so it's a natural place for an inn to spring up. And very often, a settler would build his log cabin there and would get so many people knocking on the door wanting to stay for the night that he started to make it a business. Now, I don't know that that's what happened here in this case with Walker, but at least he built his place right on the bend here in this Indian path. And if we look to one of our primary original sources of material, as you're well aware, the 1877 history of Oakland County has a very nice section about Farmington Township in there. And it mentions in there that the first tavern in Farmington was opened by Solomon Walker in 1827. Now, in 1827, Farmington Township was much bigger than it is today. It included essentially 5 townships. Most of them were not populated then. But this inn, being right on the western edge of today's Farmington Township, was actually about in the middle of this populated and settled area at that time. And the importance there is that whenever there was voting or some civil function or a town meeting or so on, they would meet at a central point, adding importance to that location. So the inn then was built in what was originally the center of mass of the people at that time.
First one was a log.
First one was a log. cabin, and it was opened in time for New Year's for 1828, and there's a lovely description of all of the people coming by ox cart and so on, and all of the time they had, the good times that they had there. And the next change to our little map here, we're closing up, taking a close-up, I should say, of the area in question. And you can see here, again, 10-mile Halstead roads shown on here, but of course they weren't in existence at that time. And the close-up of how the Indian Path went through the area, and the approximate location on the Indian Path where Walker built his first log tavern in 1827.
It's too bad he didn't separate it a little bit for 10 Mile Road, because it's kind of a mess up there now.
You might say that he caused all that, I suppose. But he was a smart businessman, and it was going through his property, so why not take advantage of that and build your establishment right on the road? Now, we don't know what it looked like, and in fact, the 1877 history points out that this was still being used as a school, like a church school and so on, even into the 1877 time period. But unfortunately, I'm not aware of any photographs that exist of the old log Walker Tavern.
They didn't do them, did they?
Well,
The photographs really are Civil War, so that was a good 40 years.
Well, I don't know, as I said, the building was around for a long time, but in the later years, apparently nobody thought to take pictures of it, or if they did, none of them have come to our attention yet. What I do have is a picture here from a wonderful book that I have about the settling of Chicago. And it has a picture of what's called the Wolf Tavern as it appeared in 1835. I'm just mentioning this because it shows you what a typical log tavern would have looked like in that time period. And we have no idea what the Walker Tavern looked like, but it could have looked something like that. Kind of small, logs, not very many windows, very informal. But it served as a stopping point for travelers and a place to buy a drink or two when you were a little thirsty, and continue then on your journey the next day.
They got the mail also. They would throw the mail pouch down, take the mail out.
Well, here, this is actually from a larger view, but there was a little Indian encampment there and a trading post, and a lot of other activities would spring up around these places. Anyway, back to our map here. I'd like to point out that Walker did build a barn right across the road from his log tavern, sort of across the road from his log tavern, in also 1827. And it's recorded in 1877 history, as you well know, as being the third framed building in all Farmington Township. Framed building meaning that the frame of the building is made from sawn lumber and not from logs. And this was quite an undertaking because it would have used very expensive wood materials. It would have taken a long time to construct and so on. Considered a better way of building, more permanent. The log structures were considered quite temporary, just a way to get in out of the weather while you got your life started in your new location.
This is the barn that you're talking about.
I'm talking about the barn now. And we do have a picture of the barn. Now, unfortunately, it's from 1904, and it's when everything was in quite a state of ruin. And here's a picture, and it shows here the Grand River Road. You can see the bend in the road here, which is this famous bend that we've been talking about. And over here is the inn in its dilapidated and ready to fall down condition. And across the road from it, we see the barn, which is even in worse condition. But that is the third framed structure, and we're only seeing a little corner of it, but there it is. That's what we have.
They were more interested in housing the animals because that was their livelihood than they were worried about their houses.
And their crops. Both very valuable to them was their livelihood, as you can imagine. So if we go back to our map again, a little while later, in about 1830, we don't know exactly for sure the date, Walker built a framed inn directly across the street from the barn, as we saw in the picture we just looked at. And at that time, the log structure was used as a meeting house for the Methodists, and they also had Sunday school classes in there for the kids. So the log structure became sort of a secondary use building, and the inn was the main building. Obviously, business was good. They could afford to build a pretty good size framed inn. And we do have a pretty good idea what that looks like. I've studied a lot of old photographs and have been able to reconstruct it as a drawing, and that would be the next picture here that we can look at. And this is a typical Greek Revival building of that time period, with large open-air porches on the front, center door, very symmetrical in nature. And that would have been this part of the inn here originally. You see the two chimneys here are these two chimneys that are here. And so this was greatly expanded in later years, but this is what they started with. So this was the Walker Inn, now from 1830, starting to become a very big and important structure. At this point, a lot of your viewers probably know about the Philbrick Tavern. The Philbrick Tavern started business at about the same time, 1827, as Walker did with his inn here. And there was an immense rivalry between the two. And there's a very interesting newspaper article written by P. Dean Warner in the Farmington Herald in about 1905. And I will attempt to do my best at reading this here. And he's describing the rivalry between Walker and Philbrick. And he says, Walker's Tavern was the most central, while Novi and Commerce, once part of Farmington Township, furnished a large portion of the voters. But Mrs. Philbrick, universally known as Aunt Senna, was a good housekeeper and a splendid cook, and knew just how much Scotch snuff to put in her pies and cakes so as to season them to the exact taste of her neighbors and friends. Her husband, Uncle Nathan, having two eyes, could see and understand the advantage of a social glass in the maintenance of a friendly relationship with his neighbors, while Uncle Solomon, referring to Walker, had but one eye with which to look after the social habits of his townsmen, and his wife, Mrs. W., was wholly ignorant of the secret process by which her rival was able to maintain the great reputation of her cookery. And then he surmises that that might be why they changed venues for the next town meeting to Philbrick from Walker. But you can see there's quite a bit of rivalry going on there. And
the Philbrick Tavern would have been on the Orchard Lake Trail or the Lansing Post Road.
Right,
there.
It would have been several miles east of the Walker Inn. North-south, about the same. A little bit more north, but not much. But what happened to the Philbrick Tavern was that it was kind of off the beaten path when the plank road went through. It lost business too, but it still exists today. We can still go look at that beautiful building.
Well, they made a gorgeous house out of it.
Oh, yes, they did. Now, because of this rivalry, Nathan Philbrick's son, Harrison, apparently decided that rather than compete with the Walker, that you buy them out, I guess, was the thinking of the time. And so in April of 1839, Harrison Philbrick purchased the inn from Walker and the 80 acres that surrounded it. Now, you have to understand that Walker owned quite a bit of land, so he still lived in the area surrounding the inn, but the 80 acres with the inn on it were now in the Philbrick family. Now, Harrison Philbrick was the older son of Nathan, and Nathan owned and operated the Philbrick Tavern from 1828 to 1853. And Harrison bought the Walker Inn just at about the time that their first child was born, Esther, who was born in 1838. So he bought the inn just after that. And you see a lot of times the buying and selling of these inns are around some big life event, usually the birth of a child. And sometimes it's the need to have an established way of making an income because you just got married and now you're starting to have your children, which is what happened here. Or it could be that you've got so many children that you realize you can't handle them in the inn and it's time to sell. So we see it in both ways here. So anyway, he owned the inn for quite a while, and then eventually sold it to Robert Wixom in 1845. And he sold it to him just shortly after his son Louis was born. Speaking of Philbrick now. So anyway, if we go back to our map here, the map hasn't really changed, but just with a notation that the property was now sold to Robert Wixom, understanding that the Philbricks and the Wixoms were intertwined. Their families grew up next door to each other, and eventually they bought the grist mill that was on Power Road just near Grand River, that also doesn't exist today, but it was in the area where the Shiawassee Park, is it?
Oh, yeah, they had quite a bit going in Shiawassee Park.
But the Wixoms and the Philbricks were co-owners of that. So they stayed in business together for many years after that. So there was a strong relationship between the two. So anyway, apparently Harrison Philbrick decided it was time to move on, and Robert Wixom Jr. was interested in the property, so he bought it. And the Wixom family is a very old family in the United States, having first come to Massachusetts in 1630. And there's a whole lineage here we could go through, but basically the Robert Sr. Wixom that came to Farmington was born in 1759 and moved to Farmington Township in 1824 at the age of 65.
He had financial problems, apparently. I was just reading something about that.
Well, he came from Hector in Seneca County, New York, where most of the people that settled in Farmington all came from right around that area. So they all kind of knew each other. I'm sure letters went back about, oh, this is a great place to settle. And as you say, land was cheap, and if you got into financial trouble, it was one way to solve your situation.
He came with the entire, we think of it as a mother and a father coming west. It wasn't that way. It was an entire group of family.
Oh, absolutely.
Including Seth Warner, whose son was P. Dean Warner. His youngest son was P. Dean. And
who we quoted from a few minutes ago.
Yes, and P. Dean married into the Botsford family, so they were.
it gets pretty confusing.
Yeah, they're all interrelated. But Robert was with his oldest son Benjamin on a piece of property, I understand. I read. Right.
Actually pretty near where I live now. They had 300 acres, and Benjamin was a justice of the peace. So he was a pretty prominent citizen at the time, and apparently had quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
Anyway, Robert Sr., his son Robert Jr. was the one who bought the inn, was newly married and was just starting his family at the time that he bought the inn.
Can you imagine poor little Sarah at 18 years old having to go out and cook for that inn?
Yeah, so you're referring to some information we haven't really revealed to our audience, but yes, Robert Jr. was born in April of 1805, and he married Sarah Jane Birch, and she was born in March of 1832. Or excuse me, she was married in 1832 to him. Sorry, I got that,
yeah, that was
a little confused there.
30 years.
Yeah, they're not 30 years different. That's the date of their marriage. Anyway, they settled on Section 15, as we said earlier. But basically, when the Wixoms decided to move out onto this was just the Robert Wixom Jr. branch of the Wixoms that moved there. Mm-hmm. Benjamin Wixom stayed on his 300 plus acres up north from there, and the aged father was living also on that property, and as you said, the whole family stayed pretty closely together. Now, Robert Jr. was 40 years old when he bought the inn in 1845. He had a young family. He had 5 children altogether. The first one was born in August of 1841. This would have been Alvin, and he died in 1906. And he was at one point a department store clerk, and at that time, that was a very highly paid profession. I don't quite understand that today, because we would think of other people as being more highly paid, but that was quite a prestigious job at that time. I imagine he knew a lot about the goods that they were selling and would probably steered people into buying the right things and could make a lot of commission money, I suppose. He was the one who later in life became blind and raised bees and was known as the blind beekeeper of Oakland County and was really quite famous around the turn of the century. And anyway, there's details here about the rest of the family. And again, a lot of this information is in that little booklet that I put together we can talk more about later on.
You know, that wonderful little booklet and the wonderful models, they're just something special.
All right, well, just to kind of move on here. When Robert Wixom bought the inn in 1845, business was still very good at the inn and increasing because the Farmington area became more or less settled by the 1840s. And now people were moving out further north and west, and so there would have been a lot of traffic down this Indian path of farmers taking their livestock to market and their crops to market or going back, settlers moving out and so on. And so I'm sure there was a lot of capital to work with that allowed him to enlarge the inn. So sometime we think probably sometime in the late 1840s, the inn was expanded. I think it would have been just this front part originally. Mm-hmm. This is the expanded version of the inn where the old Walker Inn over here was nearly doubled in size. Now there's an L off the back, which I think came in the 1850s, but I can't prove it, it's just a supposition. Anyway, there's a drawing here that I put together that shows you what this inn looked like originally. From this drawing, our good friend Brian Golden made this fabulous model, which we have here for our viewers to see today.
There's a special gauge on this, you told
This
me.
is H.O. gauge, because he's a railroad buff, and H.O. gauge is 1/8 of an inch to a foot. So 1 inch of distance along here would represent 8 feet. Mm-hmm. So, and also by the later, by looking at people in photographs and making some basic assumptions, you can get the basic dimensions for the building. And the L off the back, the specific dimensions were given in one of the later newspaper articles. So putting all of that together, we have a pretty clear idea of exactly how big it was and what it was, what it looked like.
Look at your little windows here and the doors, and you even have a stairway out the back.
Oh yeah, and that's all documented stuff, you know. And so anyway, I would urge you to take a closer look at the drawing. You can get a real good idea what it looked like. And of course, the model is a wonderful representation of that. Now, in 1850, something really important happened, and it's in the life of the inn, and that is that the Plank Road Company came through and decided to put in what was sometimes called a plank road or a military road, and it was considered necessary infrastructure in case there was ever a war and we needed to move a vast amount of troops quickly. It's much more amenable task if you have a large paved with wooden planks road that you can move all the military equipment over, as opposed to those line of blazed trees, which doesn't work too well, or the Indian paths, which kind of meander around and avoid certain hills and dales that when you build an official road, you can make bridges and cuts and so on through there.
Or the rivers that you had to hack the trees out of your way when you came up the river.
Exactly, exactly. So this next map here shows you what happened when they decided to build the plank road. Of course, they'd been talking about this for a while, but it actually got started in earnest in 1850. And in June of 1850, Robert Wixom sold a section of a little piece of his land to the Plank Road Company. Now that's shown on this map here as this red line. And this is where our problems come today for traffic in this area. The original Indian Trail is shown here as this wavy line. But when they went to put the plank road through, of course there was a couple of different Indian trails, they had to settle on one location. And so east of this area, they actually put Grand River the Grand River Plank Road and 10 Mile Road coincided, and they were one and the same. So the road actually went right down the section line road, which is 10 Mile Road. That's this blue line here coming from the east to the west. When it hit Halstead Road, they had a choice. They could have continued that straight line and would have totally bypassed the inn and picked up the Indian Trail here, which they eventually planked on the diagonal, as we all know Grand River runs today. They could have done that, but of course I'm sure the Wixoms probably were not real excited about losing all that business. So this red line here was sold from Wixom to the Plank Road Company. And in the land transfer, it tells you it's 66 feet wide and 1,100 feet long. It gives you the precise angle and so on. And it mentions that where the property ended, in other words, this red line where it ended, it's where it picked up the Indian Trail. And that is the precise location of where the road post sign was that marked the inn, and it was right in front of the inn. So if we wanted to today, we could go out there with surveyors and we could lay out and know almost exactly where the inn was originally. And I'm sure it was quite close to the road, and the road's been widened so much that probably the main part of this inn is now covered over by Grand River today, because the road is many lanes wide in that area. However, what hasn't changed is the layout of the road, and of course we have an expressway that runs through this area, but if you examine this area today, you will see that in fact the road takes a little dip to the south, and then it takes a curve back up to the north, and this intersection still is there today where you can split off between 10 Mile and Grand River. And that's 150 years later, that same Indian path is still affecting traffic in that area.
We got lost in there.
Yes. And as we said, this is about where the Bill Cook automobile dealership is today, and that's where our sign is, because it's right on that piece of property. So now we have the inn in its completed state. Of course, you can see it here. I have a couple of pictures showing it that we could look at in more detail. Basically, the L that's on the back appears to me to be a little bit later addition. I think it would have come on after 1850 when the Plank Road came through there. I'm sure their business increased a lot. They probably needed more space.
Yes.
And so it makes sense to me that this would have been added at that time. Of course, it could have been built that way earlier, but it probably is sort of the way things happened. It's not really spelled out anywhere. Now, in one of the later newspaper articles that we discovered, we have this wonderful picture here. And as a local historian, you know that images prior to 1872 are extremely rare from Farmington. I can only think of 2 or 3 other pictures. This one is from the 1850s. It's in the newspaper article that this was taken from. It was captioned as being from before the war.
And you put it in your book
And
also.
it's in the book.
The book is available at both city halls.
As I understand it, and also at Skip's Books Abound.
Books Abound, and sometimes they have it at the Warner Mansion. You can probably get it there, and
At the festival?
Brian will have some of them at the festival when the
the Founders
Historical
Festival
Society
coming up.
comes out cooperating with all these different organizations together.
But back to the picture of the inn, this extremely rare view from our area here before the Civil War, and I believe it's only one of only 2 pictures that are known from that time period. The other one is a portrait. In this picture, it's not the greatest quality because it's a tintype that was photographed in 1904 or whenever, and then printed in a newspaper, and then I photographed it from an old falling apart newspaper. So it's not a great image, but it does have a lot of really interesting detail. You can see there's a dog here. There's people all dressed up and standing in a row. People here in horses and buggies. And it looks like there's snow on the ground. There's no leaves on the trees. So it could be, for instance, some sort of a wintertime celebration. It could be a Thanksgiving, after Thanksgiving Day. It could be New Year's Day. but obviously people are now leaving the inn to go somewhere. Up till now, it's been all growth and expansion and happiness and good times and so on. There was talk of a railroad as early as 1843, but all of the local farmers were upset by that and were against it because they thought it would kill the price of horses. That was their main concern. They weren't thinking that it might help them in their bringing their crops to market and so on. Anyway, it was kind of downplayed at the time. It was talked about again at about the time of the Civil War, but because of the Civil War, it really didn't have any money to go ahead with the railroad. After the Civil War, though, things really got started in earnest in about 1867. And the railroad became known as the Detroit, Howell, and Lake Michigan Railroad, began operations in 1871. And immediately, the stagecoach lines, and you have to remember a major part of the business for an inn like this was from the stagecoach lines, which ran 20, 30 stages a day down here and kept their rooms full of travelers. They dropped that schedule to one stagecoach.
Wow.
And then very shortly after that, they stopped business altogether.
And there's more than one inn along this route.
Sure. You've got the Botsford Inn, not very far down on the other side of Farmington on Grand River, and a whole string of inns in either direction, and they were all devastated by this.
I guess it was Henry Ford who went to save a lot of these inns. That's
well, the
why
Botsford
we have the
Inn,
Botsford.
We have that today because he saved it for us. But the decline here for the Wixom Inn was also kind of hastened along by the fact that Robert Wixom, the father of the family, died in February of 1872, just when all of this was going on. So sometime in this time period, the house just became a rather large family home. Mm-hmm. I think we calculated it at around 6,000 square feet, when an average house in that time period was around 800 square feet or 1,000 square feet. So it was a huge, huge building by the standards of the day. Still would be a pretty big house today. Mm-hmm. Sarah Wixom, the mother of the family, died in 1889, with just left the three children, Albert, Horace, and Ada, mm-hmm. Adeline, left in the inn. And Ada eventually married a man by the name of Wood, moved out to the Northville area. And so then we have just the two brothers, Albert and Horace, left in the inn. And Albert was the blind beekeeper that we talked about. And Horace was the younger brother. And by 1897, the inn had really just almost collapsed on due to its own weight. They didn't have any business. They had no money. So then they did have taxes to pay. You know, in that time period, post-Civil War, we did have taxes to pay, and lots of them. And basically, they had no money to do repairs on the building. And because it was such an outstandingly huge structure, and once such a proud and fabulous building that was now in such a state of decay, it became something that was very interesting to passers-by. And at one point, a bicyclist happened by who had a camera. Now you have to understand that this is 1897. So in 1897, bicycling is all the rage. Cameras owned by average people are pretty rare. Mm-hmm. So this guy went out, took some pictures, and then wrote a newspaper article that was published in the Detroit Sunday News Tribune of 1897. And we have some pictures here we could take a closer look at later, but here's like a woodcut engraving which shows the inn perspective view. It's kind of dark and foreboding in this picture, a little hard to make out, but and you study the inn, you can see the two chimneys, and you can see the two porches and all the windows and doors. It's all there.
It didn't quite fall in yet.
Didn't quite fall in yet, but the bicyclist had a rather interesting encounter with the two brothers, And this was the encounter that you think is a little less than flattering. and I can understand how you would feel that way.
I thought it was awful.
But it's very interesting. It kind of focuses in on their peculiarities. Mm-hmm. And some of the peculiarities are that they essentially were up all night and slept during the daytime. One of the brothers was blind. They occupied completely different parts of the inn so as not to be right next to one another. They were very territorial about their possessions and so on. In fact, there's a story in this article about the time when the mother died in 1889, which wouldn't have been too many years before, and the three children, the two sons and the daughter, had to separate all of their belongings, and all of the local neighbors helped them. And they were up, there all day and most of the night separating, because whenever something new would get discovered, then everybody wanted it and they had to re-divvy up all of the stuff. Well, they were all done, everything was concluded, and they were leaving when somebody discovered a stash of, I think it was pickles that were canned in the basement. And this just caused a big uproar because they all wanted the pickles. So they had to take all the belongings, put them in a big pile, and start all over again and re-divide everything up. So they were definitely unusual people, but they were shaped by their times. And the newspaper article is extremely interesting. By the way, it's quoted in its entirety with nothing left out in the booklet that we're talking about. And it's very interesting for people who like local history. Then, amazingly, a few years later in 1904, the Detroit News-Tribune published another article. Very similar article in a lot of ways, but a lot more information. This is the article that has all the wonderful photographs in it. It has the photograph of the tintype of the inn from before the Civil War. This is in the possession of the Oakland County Pioneer and Historical Society, and it's through their generosity that we are able to use that material in the booklet and present it to our readership. For some reason that I don't understand, as you read that article, and that article is also included in its entirety in there, Horace referred to himself as Uncle Dick. We don't know why. He did have a brother, Richard, who is thought to have died at a very young age. And I don't know if he had a lapse of something snapped in his brain, or maybe his middle name was Richard. I'm not really sure. I don't think so. But for whatever reason, he calls himself Uncle Dick. So when you look at some of these pictures, it says Uncle Dick doing this and Uncle Dick doing that. Well, that's actually Horace. So one of the pictures that we have here is the front of the inn from the 1904 article, and you can see that it's in really bad shape at this point. And here, if you look closely, you can see a man with a little bowler hat standing in the midst of all that rubble, and that would be Horace. And that was his trademark, as you'll see, that was his trademark wear. Here's another interesting picture. This is showing the bar room, and look at it's actually in pretty terrific condition here in 1904. When you look at the outside, now you look at the inside, sure, there's no plaster and it's all fallen down, but it's there. The walls are straight, it's there. The bar is very interesting, and here's a young man standing at the bar for a drink, obviously posed picture here. And here we have Uncle Dick, who we all know as Horace, in his bowler hat, standing behind the bar pouring the man a drink. And it's a very, very interesting photograph. Here's another one. Here is Blind Albert, the beekeeper. And he was just very, very thin, as you can see. You can see his cane here, and these are part of his bees. Anyway, so there's a picture of Albert.
He's got the beard.
He's got a great big beard, but you have to remember the other picture was taken 50 years before this. And that person in that picture had a big white beard. So it couldn't have been him, but it sure looks familiar. Here again, you see Uncle Dick, alias Horace, with his bowler, sitting in the fiddler's box. And there's an interesting story that's related in the newspaper article. He's the one that liked to stay up all night long, and a lot of the people that would be walking down the road, his friends and neighbors and so on, going home late at night, would hear him up in the ballroom of the inn, which is in the back here, playing fiddle tunes, dancing music in the inn all by himself at night. And I don't know how accomplished he was, but he played most of the nights away, so he probably got to be pretty good after a while. But here he is sitting in what they called the fiddler's box, and this was taken from a photograph, and they made it into a line drawing, and this is also from that same newspaper article.
In their good days, they always had a party in the inn.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Every Saturday night.
Now here's a picture, not from the newspaper article. This would be from Lee Peel's book, but obviously by the angle of all of the columns that are falling in and so on, if you study it closely, you'll find out that it was taken at the same time. It had to be a photograph taken by the same photographer, but probably not used in the newspaper article, and then somebody else got a copy of the picture. Here are a lot of neighbors standing around on the front porch. And here again, this would be at about the time of the 1904 article. Here you can see great detail about the doors, the windows, and the construction of the inn, which is very, very interesting to all of us who like old buildings. And so then the question arises, what happened to this building? You know, why is it not here today? And what became of it? Well, the children that owned the inn maintained it, kept their shares in it, even Ada, who moved away. And even the mother who died, her shares stayed in her name even after her death. So there was 4 shares in the inn property. And it's actually written that way in the deeds as a share. Usually you would think of there being a boundary line, maybe divided into 4 sections, and this one had this section of the property, but they didn't do it that way. They talked about the whole property, and there were shares. There were 25% shares of the value of the whole property. So after the blind beekeeper died, Albert died, it was kind of a blow, of course, to Horace. And Horace and his sister decided to sell half, in other words, 25% shares of the property to a nearby landowner, Leverett C. Harger, in December of 1907. And Albert died in 1906, so this is, about a year later. Then in September of 1908, almost 2 years later, Oscar F. Harger, I don't know the relationship between Oscar and Leverett, probably father and son.
Father and son, and he was a sheriff in Pontiac.
So I don't know if he got it through some kind of a land deal because of a sheriff's buyout or what, but for whatever reason, Oscar acquired the remaining shares of the land from Horace and Ada in, as we said, September 1908. Then Horace bought a house on 8 Mile Road to be near his sister who lived in Northville, and he stayed there until he died until 1911. So what happened to the inn? You were the one that had the best theory on that, so why don't you tell us?
I think it just fell down from benign neglect.
And you also thought that given the size of it and its location, it could have been used as a barn for a while.
I don't know if I said that, but somebody did.
Yeah. Anyway,
I don't know.
we don't really know, but we think that's what happened. Anyway, the 2 newspaper articles are quoted in their entirety in the book, and I think it's very interesting reading, and a very interesting window on the past for our readers.
Yes, it's wonderful, and thank you for all the work you did. It's just a marvelous contribution to the community.
Well, thank you very much, Ruth. It's my pleasure, and thank you for inviting me here.
Oh, it's my pleasure to have you.